So thanks everyone so much for being here. We're really excited for this event in celebration of Women's History Month. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Committee on the Concerns for Women at Harvard and the Women in Public Policy program at the Harvard Kennedy School. We can go to slide 2. CCW is one of 5 Harvard employee resource groups that represents the interests of faculty and staff across the university with a specific focus on advocacy and equity for women. I encourage you all to subscribe to our monthly newsletter if you aren't already, and check out our social media channels on LinkedIn and Slack to get updates on events and to share your input and ideas. Applications to join CCW's executive committee will be open on our website after the event. There's a list of committee members on the slide, and we encourage you to reach out to anyone on that list with any questions about being on the executive committee and what the committee involves. Our newsletter features profiles, news, and upcoming events. The dates of our next 2 events are April 23rd, focusing on how you can update your LinkedIn profile, and on May 8th, a discussion on the importance of women shaping and telling their own narrative. I'll now turn it over to Angela, my co-chair, to introduce today's event and speaker. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Blair. Hi, everyone. I'm Angela Alberti. I'm a co-chair with Blair of the CCW. Today's event, we're honoring Women's History Month, and I'm delighted to introduce you to our speaker. Erica Chenoweth is the Academic Dean for Faculty Engagement and the Frank Stanton Professor of the First Amendment at Harvard Kennedy School, Faculty Dean at Forsheimer House at Harvard College, and a Susan S. and Kenneth L. Wallach Professor at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. They study political violence and its alternatives. At Harvard, Professor Chenoweth directs the Nonviolent Action Lab, an innovative hub that provides empirical evidence in support of movement-led political transformation. They are particularly interested in how people effectively resist authoritarianism and push for systematic change, and in using social science tools and evidence to support movement-led political transformation. Along with Zoe Marks, Chenoweth is the author of a forthcoming book, Bread and Roses, Women on the Front Lines of Revolution, and the book explores the impact of women's participation on the outcomes of mass movements. You can learn more about Professor Chenoweth on their website, and we've listed a few books and a YouTube video for your reference. After Professor Chenoweth's presentation, 2 of our executive committee members, Esther Weathers and Katie Connors, will moderate a Q&A session. And the audience is welcome and encouraged to submit your questions via chat at any time. Professor Chenoweth, we're honored to welcome you, and thank you for sharing your ideas and research with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. And I want to thank the Committee on the Concerns of Women and the Women in Public Policy program for inviting me to speak today on a topic that's awfully important to me, and I know to lots of others. And that also, I think, reflects on the importance of Women's History Month as something that that we can routinely honor and uplift as an opportunity to recover some of the histories that aren't always talked about when it comes to women's roles and changing the world. So this looks good. I will proceed.
Professor, if you could swap the displays and we'll be ready to go. Thank you.
So what I'm going to do is actually talk about that forthcoming book that was just mentioned with my co-author Zoe Marks and some of the research that is going into it. And to set the stage for where the sort of motivation for this book is coming from, I'll first just show you this graphic, which comes from a database that I maintain at the Nonviolent Action Lab here at Harvard that documents the onsets of revolutionary mass movements around the world from 1900 through the end of 2021. And so what this graph is showing is the fact that the primary mode of revolutionary mobilization over the last 50 years has really become people power, which is a form of conflict, really, where people civilians begin to mobilize without arms, but with a series of tactics like protests, strikes, boycotts, stayaways, go slows, and different forms of non-cooperation in order to affect a political outcome. And this data set focuses on what you might call revolutionary political outcomes, which means that these movements are all making demands that would fundamentally alter the sort of sovereign nature of the state, whether that's who's in charge. So these are movements demanding the ouster of an incumbent national leader, like a dictator, or the territorial integrity of the state. So, for example, some of these movements are going to be anti-colonial movements. Some of them are going to be anti-foreign occupation movements. Some of them are going to be self-determination movements in one respect or another. So these are basically revolutionary movements seeking to topple the incumbent regime or create a new state through these measures. And so what we can see is that armed struggle, the sort of dominant mode of revolutionary contention in the mid-20th century, has tapered off somewhat in terms of new onsets and been not just supplanted, but almost entirely substituted for this dominant mode of people power, which we observe around the world. So this kind of substitution took place in the 1980s, which is the first decade in which we saw more mass people power movements than armed revolutionary movements setting on in the world. And then basically has held since, and the use of nonviolent civil resistance and people power has since diffused all around the world to many different countries in which it hadn't occurred prior, at least in a documented way in the 20th century, to this extent. And so we really are living through a sort of important moment in changing technologies of mass mobilization. But one of the things that is true about the literature on the role of women in mass mobilization is that a lot of that literature focuses on the role of women in mobilizing around women's issues. So, for example, there's a very large, robust, and exciting literature on how feminist mobilization has changed the access to power for women around economic opportunity, political opportunities, changed power relations in the domestic sphere and the public sphere. And those are all extremely important interventions and instructive ones. But one of the things that's also true is that it's not always the case that when women mobilize, they're exclusively mobilizing for women's issues. Sometimes they're mobilizing for common concerns that are more kind of national issues, including self-determination, including democracy, as is pictured here with women who were involved in a mass movement against Faure Gnassingbé and Togo in various different stages in the early and mid 2000s. And we know that there are many movements that have made demands on democracy that have featured women participating on the front lines, women organizing not just the mobilization of the movement, but many of the different logistical and organizational tasks that movements have to undertake in movements that have either succeeded or failed in demanding major breakthroughs in revolutionary outcomes like democracy or like territorial independence. And so that motivates two research questions, which I'm going to present some evidence and arguments about for the rest of the talk. The first is, how does variation in women's participation in these mass movements shape their outcomes? And the second question, which is related, is, if a movement is highly gender diverse or has a very large representation of women relative to others, how does that affect the country as a whole in the aftermath of the movement? So in order to address these two questions, Zoe and I have assembled a sort of addition to the data that I presented on the first slide that shows the trajectory of mass movements over time. And in it, we augment those data by adding a number of variables that seek to capture the demographic composition of those revolutionary campaigns. So we started with a random sample of 338 campaigns from 1945 to 2014. And then now we are working with data that represents the full universe of 556 of these revolutionary campaigns observed in the post-war period through 2019. And these are both armed and unarmed mass movements, but all of them are scoped by this key maximal demand. They have to be a revolutionary movement, not a movement asking for reforms short of these sort of revolutionary outcomes. We also have, and I can talk about it during the Q&A if anybody's interested, a subset of those data from 1990 on, in which we also document the composition of movement participation when it comes to observed LGBTQ plus and youth participation, in part because it was during that time that we started to observe more people who were self-identifying or representing themselves according to those identities. And we wanted to similarly evaluate the impacts of diverse gender composition and age composition on the outcomes of these movements. So we also have data on, whether the movement succeeded or failed, meaning whether they actually did result in the outcomes that they sought to achieve. That is the ouster of the incumbent national leader within a year of the peak of the campaign, whether they achieved territorial independence, meaning full de jure and de facto territorial independence. And we looked at whether women were participating in the front lines to an extensive degree, which means that when we look at those moments of peak mobilization, does it appear that at least half of the observed participants are presenting as women, or whether, say, maybe a quarter look like they are, or whether maybe less than 10%, or maybe we don't see any people who are expressing themselves or identifying themselves as women in those campaigns at all. And there are a few campaigns and the nonviolent campaigns in which that's true, in which it looked like it was totally gender exclusive and included only men. And then there were also many armed campaigns and in which women were playing roles in the campaigns, but not frontline roles in the campaigns. So they were serving in more support roles, such as porters or cooks or people providing different types of labor for the movement other than frontline combat participation, for example. So what we're doing then with the data set is that we are putting it in conversation with other data sets that try to gauge whether and how these movements succeed or fail. And we're trying to compare these movements across these gender dimensions to try to understand the role that extensive frontline women's participation might play in the outcomes, that is the success or failure of these movements. And then, of course, we're not just interested in the success or failure in the short term, that is whether they ousted a dictator, but maybe not the dictatorship, as it were. And so we're also interested in what the country looked like, say, 5 years after the campaign ended. So that's when we're looking at questions about whether the country transitioned to a more egalitarian democracy, or whether women's empowerment improved in the aftermath of the campaign's outcome. So I'm going to present both outcomes here, but in the meantime, here is what the distribution of the data look like. So as I mentioned, we're much more likely to see higher representation of women in the nonviolent people power movements than we are in the armed campaigns. This isn't a particularly new finding. There have been a number of people who have kind of theorized and then found evidence for the idea that people power or nonviolent revolutions are more inclusive in general of people from all walks of life than armed revolutionary campaigns for lots of practical reasons. And so we are seeing more women participating in those movements in higher numbers. You can also see that we don't see any armed campaigns in our data set, at least, where we think that we can make the claim that that more than 50% of the participants in the front lines were women. So there are armed campaigns where There's high representation of women's participation between the sort of 25% to 50%, but none that are at the same level of nonviolent campaigns. The distribution of these campaigns over time can sort of be shown in this graph, which if you look in the lower left-hand corner, that's where you're seeing with these red X's down below, the armed campaigns that feature basically no observed women's participants on the front lines during peak mobilization. Whereas in the upper right-hand corner, that's where you see that we're seeing more extensive, that is 50% or greater women's participation in movements that also are nonviolent campaigns. And what you can see is that if you sort of overlaid the first chart that I showed you with this chart, you'd be seeing over time that we see more nonviolent campaigns for sure setting on. But what you can see in this graph as well is that over time, we're also seeing among those nonviolent campaigns, little blue diamonds, we're seeing a higher representation of women's participation over time, precisely because there's a correlation between their participation in nonviolent campaigns and the propensity of nonviolent campaigns in our current age. So on the very basic term, we do find strong evidence that controlling for many other factors, that extensive frontline participation of women participants, when you control for other factors, is highly associated with improvement in the probability of success, predicted probability of success for these mass campaigns. And so what we need to do then is sort of understand the reasons for that. And we have a pretty good set of explanations for this that are rooted in a lot of the existing literature about what is it that makes mass movements succeed in the first place, that helps us understand exactly why high numerical participation by women would impact those factors. So there are really four things that successful movements tend to do that are helped when women participate in large numbers. So the first is just numerical advantage itself. So from the most basic kind of revolutionary theory and mass movement theory and protest theory, we know that larger movements are more likely to win. And what we find in our data that's really interesting is that you can sort of imagine if you're excluding women from from the participation in these movements, you're eliminating so-called half the sky, right? So you're eliminating half of the potential population base. And so we might expect that the average peak participation is twice as big if women are participating in equal numbers to men. But actually, what we're finding that's really interesting is that when women are participating in those extensive numbers, the average peak participation in these campaigns is more than 7.5 times larger. So why would that be? We think that it's actually related to some of the evidence that we have on the nature of gendered networks, and that when women participate in political activities, particularly for mass movements that are making kind of national level demands, that they generally bring with them a broad network of other participants. And so it really not just increases, by half the potential population that's participating, but it brings along lots of important networks and really like supercharges the participation overall. Now, the reason why numbers are important isn't just because big movements get things done. Actually, it would be a mistake to assume that, because a lot of movements can get a lot of people in the streets, but then nothing happens. It's because movements that are very large and that draw on exactly these diverse networks are much better able to achieve the other three important tasks that movements do when they win. Tactical innovation, which is the creation and creativity of new tactics that draw on the expertise and social knowledge of its participants, that range not just from street protest to, say, march, but that also deploy tactics of non-cooperation, like a strike, like withholding of labor, like a stay-at-home demonstration when people are expected to be out and about, going about their business in an ordinary way. And another kind of bucket of potential tactics relates to what we call alternative institutions, which is basically creating new forms of provision of public services, new types of ways of engaging new organizations that can provide much needed care and capacity to the population, and that help the movement build legitimacy from below. And so all of these things are better served both when you have large but also very diverse networks. And so I'll give a couple of examples for why that's the case. You might have heard of the tactic of the boycott. The boycott is a particular method now understood to mean just the withholding of buying power around a particular product. Sometimes if it's a political boycott, it's the withholding of one's vote, say, during a scheduled election as a sign of protest. But the term actually comes from its initial target, Captain Charles Boycott, who was an absentee British landlord in Ireland in the late 19th century. And what was happening in Ireland in the late 19th century was a mass movement, an independence movement, in which there were various claims being made about the exploitative practices of British landlords, their tendency to extract rents with no regard at all to what was at that point the starvation of the Irish population in the aftermath of the Great Famine, and a tendency to repossess lands, evict tenants, and engage in a number of different unjust and unfair practices with regard to basic human needs. And so in the late 1880s, the Irish Land League was banned by the British government for its anti-colonial activities. But the British government didn't think to ban the Ladies' Land League because they were viewed to be unthreatening. Now, unbeknownst to the British government, the Ladies' Land League was actually quite, shall we say, willing to deploy very confrontational tactics and build alternative institutions, such as building makeshift homes for people on lands that they'd been evicted from. They were willing to establish underground markets and other forms of mutual aid and self-help in the context of these deprivations and various forms of privation. And so they went about that. And then this one British landlord, Charles Boycott, was going to be coming back to his manor. And a number of the women who would otherwise be providing those services, the cooks, the tailors, people who worked there, came up with this idea that if we don't do it, if we don't provide any of the services that he's used to, we'll make life so miserable for him that he won't come back. And they convinced many other people, shopkeepers, merchants, and others in County Mayo, to similarly join them in what was effectively a social and economic ostracization campaign. That campaign worked. He left, never to return, and it became widely understood and talked about, as depicted in this magazine photo in Vanity Fair, which covered the matter. Now, others were inspired by the particularly unique form of the withholding of cooperation from what was perceived to be an unjust system, including it's sometimes understood Mahatma Gandhi, who was himself at a point where in the late 19th century and early 20th century, he was studying these different types of techniques and had a lot of commentary both about the Irish independence movement and later about the women's suffrage in the UK and the different tactics that they were using. Similarly, the Igbo women in Nigeria resisted practices of British colonial taxation, which were actually imposed on the society during colonization, before Igbo women had a very important role in determining the distribution of resources, such as would be provided under different taxation practices. And they had a really important veto power on different decisions that would be made at the local level. And so they launched a very important and sustained campaign against warrant chiefs and perceived collaborators with British colonial taxation practices, which were written in the colonial record as the Aba Women's Riots, but are remembered, thanks to some feminist Nigerian scholars who recovered this history, is remembered as the Igbo Women's War. in the country. And during that campaign, they realized again that if they made a life impossible for people who were participating in these exploitative practices, that they could compel them to change their behavior. So they initiated a tactic called sitting on a man, which was basically the idea of going to the collaborator's home and making a lot of noise, shaming them, not threatening them necessarily physically, but just with social shunning and other consequences for participating in these practices. And over time, there were very important concessions made to them, and they were given, again, veto power over taxation practices and other governance issues. What's really important to know is that this particular mode of resistance and the tactics that were innovated during it then provided the foundation for women's participation in the ultimate anti-colonial movement in Nigeria that then swelled in the next several decades, and then ultimately potentially even in the democratization movements that took place in Nigeria over the 1990s. So the sort of heritage and legacies of these issues remain in place over the long term. So it's well known that women played a key role in Russia's February Revolution of 1917, not so much in the October Revolution that came after it, in which the Bolsheviks and Lenin seized power and sort of expelled people who were sympathetic to the revolution, but not sympathetic to their goals, and initiating a civil war and other things. And at that point, there are a lot of very interesting feminist critiques by women who were involved in the February Revolution and who felt like they'd been totally sidelined during the sort of consolidation of power under Lenin. So the third thing that movements needed to do well, other than have large numbers and have the ability to innovate new tactics based on people's social knowledge and the creativity that they can bring to bear based on it, is they need to be able to initiate defections within the opponent's pillars of support. And what we find, and one measure of defections is the refusal of security forces to go along with normal business. Now, security forces aren't the only pillars of support that might defect. You can have business and economic elites, you can have cultural authorities, the civil service, state media, lots of people who kind of prop up the system as it's working, whose cooperation is required in order for it to keep going. But security forces, sometimes their defections are quite easy to observe. For example, they put their guns down and refuse to fire on demonstrators when they are ordered to. Sometimes there are mass desertions. They don't show up for work. They call in sick in like huge numbers in the thousands. And so those can be observed fairly easily. And in this instance, what we find, again, is that women who participate in very large numbers or movements in which women participate in those large numbers are more likely to see more security force defections as those numbers rise. So we think that part of the reason for this is, again, related to the ability of inclusive movements to draw upon basically micro-level personal networks that can have big macro political consequences. So, 5 years ago this month, we were in the midst of what's sometimes called the Smile Revolution or the Hirak Revolution in Algeria, which ousted a 30 years long dictatorship of Bouteflika. And what we're seeing here is actually a photo from International Women's Day, which was a day on March 8th of 2019, in which organizers of the movement asked women to come out in large numbers because they'd heard that the riot police were going to come out in large numbers. And they thought if they had all the women out in the streets and celebrating International Women's Day while they were calling for democracy, that it was less likely that the police would fire. And this is a picture of who became a sort of very famous icon of the Smile Revolution. She's a teacher from the town, the part of Algiers where she was protesting. And these police were also from the part of Algiers where she was protesting. And she was saying to them, I think I recognize you from class. I know your mother. Why are you out here wearing that uniform? Like you should be with us. And she just like went up and down the lines trying to talk to these people and sort of reason with them. And what I've been told by people who were eyewitness to these events is that there were no arrests and no injuries, nothing that day. Like it was like the most peaceful day of the protest movement, and was a turning point in the movement and what felt like a major political shift in the balance of power against Bouteflika. And sure enough, within weeks, he stepped down. Now, what's really important to know isn't necessarily that we're essentializing, the fact that women are somehow better at eliciting these defections. But I think there are really two things going on. One is, like I said earlier, if you have more people and you have people with more diverse networks, they have lots of more connections than a movement would otherwise have. And they have different types of values that they can appeal to in common with members of the adversary's pillars of support. So in this instance, this person might have these micro-level relationships that when they aggregate together lead to these macro political outcomes, which is a refusal to engage in repression against a movement on an otherwise hugely important kind of political day. Similarly, in the Philippines, in the people power movement, there were some very famous kind of standoffs between the government of Ferdinand Marcos and the movement, with the military squarely in between. And there were apparently orders to engage in killings of protesters, that there were outright refusals to abide. And in at least one documented instance, the literal explanation for why the security forces refused the order was because there were nuns in the crowd, and they thought it would not be okay to engage in violence against them. In this instance, also from the people power movement, we see that those types of moments of just refusal to go along with an order that feels uncomfortable for any number of sort of values-based reasons, in the end does lead to Marcos resigning or being overthrown, as it were. Now, the fourth thing that successful movements do is that they maintain organizational resilience and discipline even as repression against them escalates. So repression is escalating basically against all of these movements. They're revolutionary movements, if you recall. And so they're all making extreme demands effectively on the incumbent government, either to step down or grant them independent territory. And that means that, at some point, the government will respond. And in almost every one of our cases, the government responds at least once with violence. Now, when movements are very large, very diverse, and are able to maintain nonviolent discipline, they are more likely to actually be able to survive that kind of repression, and in fact, often benefit from it politically. And I don't mean to say that in a callous way, but I mean to say it that the repression provides such a stark contrast to the movement's own discipline that it often is what initiates those security force defections, or it initiates broader international or public support for the movement. And so we had a question of, okay, so if that's true, are these large movements in which women are featuring on the front lines in very large numbers more likely to be able to maintain that discipline, meaning that they don't develop an armed flank than their more gender exclusionary counterparts? And the answer is definitely yes, that we see those movements as being more likely to maintain discipline. So I've mentioned the sort of short-term outcomes, which is success and failure. That is, they oust the dictatorship or they become territorially independent. What do these countries look like after the campaigns end? So what we did was we looked at two outcomes. One is whether there is a change in the quality of the democracy. Egalitarian democracy is a sort of concept that that emphasizes not just the on-paper nature of democratic institutional governance, but also a more qualitative measure of democracy that focuses on whether there's high discrimination in the society in spite of the on-paper commitments, whether people generally enjoy equal access to political competition and opportunities, and whether resources are generally shared in a way that doesn't discriminate among groups for social or identity reasons. So egalitarian democracy is sort of the highest quality of democracy. And what we find is that if you look on the left-hand side, the left-hand panel, that the red line indicates the change in the level of egalitarian democracy 5 years after the campaign has ended. So this is a single point in time. If women are participating in very high numbers on the right here, that's where you have the greatest change toward egalitarian democracy. And likewise is true for violent campaigns. That's the right panel here, that for armed campaigns where women are participating in greater numbers, you're also more likely to see improvements in that way. Now, what's jarring about these findings, though, is if you look back under nonviolent campaigns on the left-hand panel, and you look at the blue line, this is what happens in countries where women are participating in very large numbers, but the movement fails. So in other words, the movement doesn't achieve that short-term breakthrough, like Bouteflika stays in power. And this is what happens to those countries 5 years after. And what it looks like is that there's actually a regression in egalitarian democracy. So something's going on where the backsliding is worse and the quality of the democracy is worse than it was before the movement started. We don't see the same effect with violent campaigns, and we have an explanation for that, but I'll quickly move ahead to the next slide to show you what's going on with women's empowerment and then get to the point. So on this slide, you'll see a very similar pattern. Instead of the egalitarian democracy measure, what we're looking at here is change in women's empowerment specifically. And we see a very similar pattern, that there's a modest improvement in countries in which women participate in nonviolent campaigns in large numbers or achieve gender parity with men. But there is a backsliding when those movements fail. And what we think is going on is that it is known by authoritarian opponents in particular that when women participate in very large numbers, it's threatening to them. And if they happen to survive that wave of mobilization, they regress to more patriarchal policies and more authoritarian policies to prevent such mobilization from happening again. And so I think the key takeaways from this are, first of all, that it is established based on our findings, at least, that women's participation does help these movements win, and that the success of the movements does create new opportunities, both for the expansion of democracy for everyone and for modest improvements in gender equality. And we think that actually the participation of women in these movements throughout the 20th century and in the post-war period in particular is actually a really maybe not fully understood explanation for how democracy spread in the 20th century at all. So I think ours is the first book to make this link, but not between the role of mass movements in bringing about different waves of democracy, but the conditional effect of that, which is to say that this is true when women participated in large numbers, more than when women were excluded from movements. But here's the high stakes part. When women do participate in very high numbers, but those movements are defeated in the short term, that's when we see major patriarchal backlash taking place. That means that gender empowerment regresses and democracy regresses together. And so what Zoe and I really conclude from this is that it is true that women's rights and well-being can be canaries in the coal mine for backsliding and authoritarian consolidation, much like the rights of minorities, ethnic or racial minorities the rights of the poor and working class, the rights of sexual and gender minorities. And part of this is because when people are subjected to second-class citizenship or worse in societies, and they don't have the same access to the resources that others do, that it is actually hard to call it an egalitarian democracy. So with that, I think I will leave some of the more practical implications of this to our discussion in the Q&A. But I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this research in progress, and also to acknowledge research assistance from an incredible team of research assistants from Harvard over the years, and funding from various institutes and foundations that have helped to support the research that's leading to this book. So with that, I will stop sharing my slides for now, and I really look forward to the discussion and the Q&A. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Chenoweth. Hold on, I'm going to add myself here. Hi, everyone. That was outstanding. Thank you. My name is Katie Connors, to everyone who's here. I have been a member of the CCW for the last 7 years. And anytime we get to have a faculty member come and talk about their outstanding research, we love it. So thank you so, so much. I think before I dive into some of the other things, I think the question we're getting the most is, when will this book be available?
Wouldn't I like to know? The book will be available as soon as we completed the writing and sent the manuscript into our wonderful publishers at Princeton University Press, and we hope that it'll be out sooner rather than later. Unfortunately, it won't be before the end of this calendar year, but probably the next.
Okay, awesome. Well, first, again, amazing presentation. Thank you so much. One of the questions we have for you is, what inspired you to move into this area of research, and what continues to inspire you and keep you engaged with this work over time?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think, what inspired me the most to get involved in this particular research question was lots of interactions that I've had with activists and organizers over the years in trainings and workshops and seminars in my own classroom, and feeling like there was a lot of really interesting stuff to say about how movements succeed, but no real recognition as to the sort of gendered dimensions of many of those aspects of movement success. And in workshops that I attended with activists in particular, I used to participate in some of these and be teaching faculty and some trainings as well. And if it was like a 5 or 6 day long training, by the second day of the training, women activists in the room would sort of revolt and say, we don't feel like our experience is actually being fully reflected by the way that we're talking about these movements and the sort of tasks of movements. And we feel like we've literally invented some of this stuff. And I sort of was curious about that. But as I started getting more thoroughly read into some of the histories of these movements, I realized that's sort of true. And not only does the literature not talk about it, we don't bring it into the conversation in a lot of our more practical workshops and trainings and orientations to this type of material. It's very instructive, right? So a lot of movements are trying to figure out, how can we best respond to this sort of current democratic recession around the world? We're 17 years into it. It's getting worse, not better. What should we be doing? Well, this is a factor that wasn't fully appreciated 10 years ago that now is. And so we can say, based on these historical patterns, the ability to sort of achieve, gender inclusion and gender parity in a movement is going to help determine, if the movement wins, whether the movement is going to actually lead to the outcomes you want, right? And so that's a big piece of it. And the other piece of it is just, it's very validating for people to see themselves accurately reflected and portrayed in the record. And so I think Zoe and I both really appreciate and are honored by and humbled by the chance to be able to do that.
Absolutely. I think you touched so much about, talking about the activists and organizers. And I think something important to our audience that's here today is, we're in an election year with 64 elections happening across the globe, right? And so what are some takeaways or things that you would share, with us and with those groups of sort of practical, implications or ways to be engaged and active citizens and members of the Harvard community?
Yeah. So I'll say two things about it. The first is to always remember the four things movements have to do to win is build large and diverse coalitions, induce defections. This is very unappreciated. The whole reason to build large and diverse coalitions is to get those defections. And then the third thing is, tactical innovation. And the fourth thing is organizational discipline and resilience. And so, all of those things I think can be usefully on one's mind as we think about what might be required of us in engaging in civil society-led efforts to improve our democracy, to support democratic leaders and what they need to do, et cetera. The second thing that I'll say is, as we're doing that, I think this research really lends itself to the implication, as I mentioned, that we should really pay attention to support and uplift those movements who are trying to self-consciously do this in an inclusive way. And that those are the movements that are most likely to lead us to the types of inclusive democratic outcomes that will improve life and access for all. But I also think that those things don't necessarily happen automatically. And so when it comes to like how to support or whom to support, I think that in research I've done with Maria Stephan, which is sort of a separate project, we looked at if you're like a donor that's trying to figure out which type of civil society organization to support, for example, and what types of support they might need. It turns out that the most effective form of support is convenings and trainings. And the reason for that is because it's not so much like money that a lot of movements need, although maybe there are movements that need some money, but it's more the ability actually to come together in the same room and hash out some of the differences, hash out questions about tactics and strategy, hash out potential sources of conflict so that they can build a larger coalition. Because that larger coalition then is what unleashes the creativity and the skills and the sources of social knowledge that people have to bring to bear on this collective problem of our democracy. And so what this means is that you're often in needing to communicate with, cooperate with, and trust people with whom you've had no interaction or potentially even quite antagonistic or negative reactions in the past, and trying to build, a very high stakes coalition with them. So to the extent that convenings and trainings can help people to begin to build the connective tissue that's required of a civil society that has to be effectively the beachhead for democracy and one that is under threat, then I think that's a really powerful way to invest and to support civil society. And then the last thing I'll say is not to underestimate the importance of defections. So there's a lot of talk about building a large coalition and perhaps less talk and less practice with inducing defections. And so, I think that really has three implications. The first is bolstering bridging civil society. So places where people really do come together across quite stark differences. This is, in faith communities and like chambers of commerce, business communities, places that aren't actually supposedly political, but are highly politicized in these types of contexts, and seeing the degree to which they can be supported and remaining a bridge between difference. The second is, of course, supporting that organizational capacity and coalition building. And the third is supporting the ability for people to build their negotiation, bargaining, and conflict resolution skills. Because a huge part of keeping a coalition together in a high stakes environment is being able to resolve those differences midstream without it breaking apart a coalition or fragmenting it at a moment when it's most important to stay together.
Outstanding. All right. Well, I am going to pass it over to my other co-moderator, Esther, who has some more questions for you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Chenoweth. Okay, so nothing excites me more than about coalition building. So I love that that's what we're talking about, and not just any coalition, right? A diverse coalition, high stakes. Okay, so now that we're on the topic of high stakes, let's talk about higher education, because it is a hot topic. The New York Times is nonstop. And so I'm curious, you've talked about the 4 key kind of strategies, you've talked about the convening, the training, the communication. So how do you approach, how do you apply essentially your theories and frameworks to the lens of higher education in this moment where there is an attack on higher education? And we know that it's been happening for years, but it has truly come to fruition with the removal of affirmative action and other policies moving through to strip away DEI efforts.
Yeah. Well, I think that it can be really helpful and important to see these types of attacks as not isolated and intended to pull apart the fabric of democracy. And so what that means is that they're not isolated from the shared struggles of many people with democratic aspirations. It can be very tempting to be in a sector and see attacks on one sector as attacks on the sector. And I think what's important is to just understand the broader context of, there are many people who are under attack. This is one of them. And how can we build a broad, strong, powerful coalition of people who want to protect democracy and see, protecting each other as part of that. And so I think that's one of the things I would say. The second thing is more about like the need to try to think a few steps ahead of the adversary at this point. So I mentioned earlier that we've got like 17 years plus now of democratic recession, year over year. The retreat of democracy globally. And what that means is that in some countries that were already authoritarian, they've gotten more authoritarian. Some countries that were sort of transitioning toward democracy have backslid into authoritarianism. And countries that were erstwhile quite advanced, established democracies are deconsolidating. So that's what the recession means. So when you're in a deconsolidating or deconsolidated democracy, it can feel very much like being on the defensive because you are on the defensive in a way. Have you not anticipated it? And so I think that this is why convenings that are very broad-based, that are multi-sector, that are building coalitions across sectors and populations that have a common claim of trying to not just maintain, but improve a democracy, really have to get together on that and not feel like they're being divided and ruled. So it really is sort of the only way to then get those 2 steps ahead and begin to define the terms of the pro-democracy movement in ways that aren't actually always just responding to the latest critique, but in fact are telling its own story, making its own promises, setting its own vision for where we are headed, and doing so in a way that perhaps takes the critiques and like shows either why they're entirely baseless or shows that they can be addressed with the vision that we're putting ahead. And so I think that going more on the offensive and being unapologetic about the aspirations of building a genuine, multiracial, feminist democracy are not demands that are really threatening to anyone except those who truly and genuinely oppose those outcomes. And that we have to learn to live together as neighbors. That's what democracy is. It's conflict resolution without killing each other at the national level. And we also have a majority of the population who want the country to move in that direction. And we're learning how to act like that majority.
Thank you so much for that. I'm sitting here thinking, okay, I got to play chess. I got to get better at thinking of my opponent's next move. So that's really one of my key takeaways. But I also want to highlight, okay, CCW, you're hearing this first, right? As members, we do represent a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual, multi-generational coalition. And there is an opportunity here for us to coalesce around these issues that are not just impacting higher ed, but broad. And I so appreciated your statement, Professor Chenoweth, about it's happening across. This is just one sector, but you need to be seeing all the linkages because it's a bigger strategy. So I appreciate that. I do want to get to some audience questions, and this one I'm really interested in. It's about LGBTQ movements and how they have been successful, but we are still facing an authoritarian backlash. So is there an explanation for this?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think the most available off-the-shelf explanation is one that actually is drawn from theories of sort of racism and racist backlash. And there's a sort of parallel argument, put forward by Susan Faludi about patriarchal backlash, which we draw from in our book as well, which is that when there are progressive breakthroughs that aren't consolidated, there's often a backlash against them. And that can be true even as the arc of progress is moving, more quickly than it is receding. There's sort of strategies for blocking these adverse coalitions that are going to organize a backlash. They don't always succeed because they're not always very well organized, or they just don't have the support and backing. In this instance, what's kind of interesting in my mind about the current backlash is that it is there, at least at the beginning, seemed to be more backlash against transgender rights than there was against say lesbian, gay, and bisexual rights. So for example, there's higher support for same-sex marriage than there is, for example, for providing access to youth for gender-affirming healthcare and things along those lines. However, that's also a potential wedge area for the LGBTQ movement that needs to be more unified around. So I think that's the explanation for why the backlash happens, and in many ways is to be anticipated. And also, there are strategies we can learn from many different types of movements about how to build a positive coalition and prepare for and block adverse coalitions when they can be anticipated a couple of years down the line.
Right. It goes back to that chess, folks. Don't get stuck in the wedge, right? We really do need to be unified in our efforts. So I appreciate that. And unfortunately, we've had such a great conversation that we ran out of time. So I want to hand it back over to my co-moderator to close us out. But before I do, let's give Professor Chenoweth all the good energy. So, the emoji reactions. But thank you so much for your wisdom and just your knowledge.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be in conversation with you, and hope that you all get in touch if you want to follow up.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We'll share follow-up resources, videos, keep us posted on that book. And very exciting. Thank you everyone for joining. We're at time. We'll send a survey to get your feedback on today's session. We'd love to hear, more from the group on what sort of materials you're looking for from the CCW. And don't forget to connect with us if you don't get our newsletter. We put links for that in the chat, as well as an application for our executive committee. We're looking for the next academic year. Send us an email, send us a note. Thank you so much again for taking lunch to do this. We know it can be hard, but we really appreciate everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you again, Professor Chenoweth.
Yes, thank you.